Stevie Nicks stopped singing on the word silver. She had been inside the song the way she is always inside a song. Not performing it from the outside, but inhabiting it. The way she has inhabited songs for 50 years. As though the music is a room she knows how to be in, and the audience is permitted to watch her be there. Her voice had been doing what her voice does, which is something that cannot be fully described and does not need to be, because everyone in that studio already knew what it was and had come specifically to be in the presence of it again. And then she stopped. On the word silver. The word that did not finish. The note that had no resolution. Her eyes had found something in the audience. She was not scanning. She had not been looking. She had been inside the song, eyes half closed, the way she goes when the music has her fully. And then she had opened her eyes, and they had gone immediately, without searching, to a woman in the 6th row who was holding up a photograph. An old photograph. Small, held in both hands, raised above the heads of the people in front of her. A woman in her 70s standing in a row of seated people with a photograph, raised as though offering it to the stage. Stevie Nicks looked at the photograph. Her voice stopped. Her right hand, which had been moving in the slow circular motion it makes when she is deep inside a song, went still. Her eyes did not move from the photograph. Her lips stayed parted around the word that was not finished. The word silver hanging in the air of the studio with nowhere to go. Jimmy Fallon was standing at the side of the stage. He had been watching with the reverence you maintain when Stevie Nicks is performing in your studio, which is the reverence of someone who understands that what is happening is larger than the room it is happening in, and requires nothing from him, except to be present and grateful. He saw her stop. He saw her eyes go to the 6th row. He saw something move across her face that he could not name. He did not move. 300 people in that studio held their breath. It was a Wednesday night taping. March 2024. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. Stevie Nicks was the musical guest. A new record. An occasion, not a booking. The kind of appearance where the production team knows from the moment it is confirmed that this is not a night like other nights. She had walked out with a particular quality of presence she has carried since 1975, which is not the presence of a performer, but of something more elemental, a weather system, a force that fills a room before it speaks. The audience had responded the way audiences respond to Stevie Nicks, which is not with noise, but with something closer to recognition. The sound of 300 people understanding simultaneously that they are in the presence of someone who has been part of the private architecture of their lives. She had sat with Jimmy Fallon first. The interview had been warm and precise. She had talked about the new record with the specific enthusiasm of someone who finds, still, after 50 years, that making something new is more interesting than living on what has already been made. She had said something about age and creativity that made 300 people very still in the good way. She had laughed at something Jimmy said. A real laugh, brief and unguarded. Then she had moved to the stage. She had stood at the microphone. The band had settled. She had looked out at the audience for a moment with the settled attention of someone about to do something she has done 10,000 times and has not yet found a reason to stop doing. She began the song. She was 3 verses in when she stopped. The entire studio froze. 300 people who had been inside the music with her sat in total silence, watching Stevie Nicks stand at a microphone and look at a photograph being held up in the 6th row with an expression that had no professional frame around it. No distance, no management, just the raw surface of a face in the presence of something that has arrived from very far away and landed without warning. Jimmy Fallon had not moved. His hand was raised from the moment he registered that something had changed. His mouth was slightly open. He looked at Stevie Nicks, and then at the sixth row, and then at Stevie Nicks, trying to assemble what he was seeing into something he could understand. He could not. The band looked at each other. No one played. Stevie Nicks stepped away from the microphone. She walked to the edge of the stage. She looked down at the woman in the sixth row, at the photograph being held up in both hands, and she said one word, not into any microphone, not for any audience, just said it into the air of the studio, the way you say the name of something you thought you had lost. She said, "Joanna." 300 people held their breath. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1974. Stevie Nicks wasn't always Stevie Nicks. Icon. Legend. The woman in the shawl whose voice became the sound of something that a generation of women used to understand themselves. In the fall of 1974, she was 26 years old and living in Los Angeles with Lindsey Buckingham in an apartment that was too small and too loud and not quite warm enough, and she was cleaning houses to pay rent while they tried to make the music work. She had been trying to make the music work for 7 years. The trying had cost her things, comfort, stability, the version of her life that was easier and more predictable and that she had decided, somewhere in her early 20s, was not worth having at the price of the music. She had been cleaning houses for 2 years. She cleaned houses in the Bel Air Hills on weekdays, driving up the winding roads in a car that made a sound that worried her, arriving at doors where people with large rooms and small concerns were temporarily absent and needed their surfaces wiped down. She was not bitter about it. She was using the time to write. She carried a notebook to every house she cleaned and wrote in it during breaks, sitting on other people's kitchen floors with her back against their cabinets, writing songs in the margins of the hours she sold. In the spring of 1974, Lindsay's lease arrangement changed, and they needed to move. They found a larger apartment in Laurel Canyon that they could afford only if they took in a roommate. They put a note on a bulletin board at a music shop on Sunset Boulevard. A woman named Joanna Price answered the note. She was 28 years old. She was from Flagstaff, Arizona. She had come to Los Angeles 2 years earlier with a degree in art history and no particular plan except the plan of being somewhere other than Flagstaff, which had begun to feel, at 26, like a place that was happening without her participation. She was working as a waitress at a restaurant in Silver Lake and painting in a rented studio space 2 evenings a week, making paintings that no one had yet bought, but that she was making anyway, because not making them had not turned out to be an option. She moved into the third room of the Laurel Canyon apartment in May of 1974. She and Stevie Nicks became friends with the particular speed of 2 people who are both in the middle of something difficult and find in the other person the specific relief of being understood without needing to explain the difficulty first. They were both trying to make something in a city that was not waiting for them. They were both supporting the attempt with work that had nothing to do with the attempt. They were both young enough to believe the attempt was going to resolve in their favor, and experienced enough to understand that the belief required daily renewal. They cooked together when there was enough to cook. They sat on the small balcony in the evenings, and Joanna talked about the paintings, and Stevie talked about the songs, and neither of them performed optimism for the other. Because neither of them had the energy for performed optimism, and anyway it was not what the other person needed. What the other person needed was to be told that the thing they were making was real and worth continuing. And they told each other that, in the plain language of people who have decided honesty is more useful than encouragement. Stevie was writing what would become Landslide during those months. She has spoken about the song in interviews for 50 years, about the mountaintop where the final words arrived, about what she was afraid of at 26, about the specific fear of time passing without the thing you are trying for arriving. She has not spoken, in those interviews, about Joanna Price, who was sitting on the balcony the night the first verse came together, and who listened to Stevie sing it through once and said, "That's the one. That's the song you've been trying to write. Everything you've been saying on this balcony for 6 months is in that." She said, "Don't change a word." Stevie did not change a word. She brought Joanna into the recording session as a witness when they laid down the first version, not as a musician, not as a contributor, simply as a person whose presence in the room had been part of the making of the song, and who deserved to be there when it became real. Joanna stood in the corner of the studio and listened to the song she had first heard on a balcony in Laurel Canyon, and said nothing. Because there was nothing to say that the song was not already saying better. A friend of Lindsay's had a camera. He took photographs in the studio that day. One of them was of Stevie and Joanna standing together. Stevie in the clothes she always wore in those years. The shawl, the boots. The specific quality of someone who has already become the thing she is even before the world has agreed to call it that. And Joanna beside her in a paint-stained jacket. Both of them looking at something outside the frame. Both of them mid-laugh. Both of them 26 and 28 years old, and not yet knowing what was coming. Joanna had kept the photograph. She had kept it through the rest of Los Angeles and through the move back to Arizona in 1977 when the painting began to sell, and Flagstaff no longer felt like a place that was happening without her. She had kept it through a marriage and 3 children and a studio on the main street of Flagstaff where her paintings hung in the window and sold with enough regularity to make the work sustainable. She had kept it through the 50 years of Stevie Nicks becoming what Stevie Nicks became, through every album and every tour and every interview in which the song was discussed, in none of which did Joanna Price's name appear, because Joanna had never told anyone. She had not told anyone because there was nothing to tell that she thought anyone would believe, or that needed to be believed. The friendship had been real. The song had been what it had been. The photograph was in a drawer. That was enough. Her daughter Cecily had found the photograph in 2023 while helping Joanna organize the studio. She had held it up and said, "Mom, is this who I think this is?" Joanna had said, "We were roommates for 8 months." Cecily had looked at her mother for a long moment. She had said, "Does she know you exist?" Joanna had said, "She knew. I don't know what she remembers." Cecily had said, "Mom, you have to do something about this." Joanna had said, "I don't have to do anything about anything." It was a long time ago. But Cecily had found the Tonight Show submission form, and she had filled it out without telling her mother. And she had described the photograph and the apartment in Laurel Canyon and what her mother had said about the first verse of Landslide on a balcony in 1974. And she had hit send. The response had come back in 2 weeks. The producer who received it had gone directly to Stevie Nicks's management. The management had gone directly to Stevie Nicks. Stevie Nicks had read the submission on a Tuesday morning and had not spoken for several minutes. Then, she had said, "Joanna Price, from Flagstaff." She had said, "I have thought about her so many times. I never knew how to find her." She had asked for one thing. Put her in the audience. Don't tell me where she's sitting. Let me find her. Behind the scenes, Stevie Nicks had made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. She had told no one in the production what she was planning to do. She had told the band only that she might stop at some point during the performance, and that they should be ready to wait. The band had looked at each other and accepted this, because when Stevie Nicks tells you to be ready to wait, you are ready to wait. She had not been told which row Joanna was in. She had asked not to be told. She had said, "I want to find her the way I always found things in those days. By looking." Joanna Price had been brought to the studio by Cecily, who had told her mother only that there were tickets available, and that she had always wanted to see Stevie Nicks perform, and could they please just go. Joanna had agreed, slightly suspicious, slightly moved by her daughter's persistence, and had brought the photograph because Cecily had asked her to. Just bring it, Mom. Just in case. And Joanna had put it in her coat pocket and not thought about it again until Cecily leaned over during the third verse and whispered, "Now, Mom, hold it up." Joanna had held it up. And Stevie Nicks had found her. Now the studio understood what it had been watching. Stevie Nicks had been looking for a face she did not know was in the room, with a readiness she had not announced to anyone. And when the photograph went up in the 6th row, she had found it without searching, because some faces do not require searching. Because some faces have been part of you for so long that you recognize them before the recognition forms into a thought. She was at the edge of the stage. Jimmy Fallon had come to the edge of the stage beside her, his hand still raised from 2 minutes ago. His mouth still unable to produce what it was trying to produce, his face entirely open and unmanaged. The face of a man who has stopped trying to be a television host because what is happening in the room has made that role temporarily unavailable. He tried to speak. His mouth moved. The word started and stopped. He pressed his lips together. He looked at Stevie Nicks, and then at Joanna Price, and then at the photograph, and then at the audience, and he shook his head once, slowly, and the shaking said everything his voice was not producing. Joanna Price was still standing in the 6th row, with the photograph held in both hands. She was 71 years old, a compact woman with silver hair and paint on the cuff of her jacket that she had not noticed before she left Flagstaff and was not thinking about now. She was looking at Stevie Nicks with the expression of someone who is trying to determine whether what is happening is what it appears to be. Stevie Nicks said, "You came." Joanna said, "Cecily told me to hold up the photograph." Stevie Nicks laughed. It was a real laugh, brief, surprised. The laugh of someone who has been undone and finds the undoing almost funny, which is the only way to survive being undone in front of 300 people. She said, "I have been trying to find you for 40 years. Joanna said, "I was in Flagstaff." Stevie Nicks said, "I know that now." She sat down on the edge of the stage, the way Paul Simon had sat on the edge of the stage, the way that gesture means, I am taking myself down from the place of performance and sitting with you at the level where things are real. She said, "Do you know that I think about you when I sing that song? Still, every time." Joanna was quiet for a moment. She said, "Which song?" Stevie Nicks looked at her. She said, "Joanna, you were on the balcony." Joanna Price closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she said, "I knew what the song was going to be before you did." Stevie Nicks said, "I know. That's why I think about you." She said, "You told me not to change a word." Joanna said, "It didn't need changing." Stevie Nicks reached into her jacket. She removed a photograph, her own copy, kept for 50 years, the same image from the same session, 2 women standing together in a studio in 1974, mid-laugh, looking at something outside the frame. She held it out. Joanna Price looked at the photograph. She looked at her own face at 28 years old. She looked at Stevie's face, already entirely the face it was going to be for the next 50 years. Already the face on all the albums and all the stages, already fully arrived at itself. She took the photograph with both hands. She held both copies now, hers and Stevie's, one in each hand, the same moment from 2 different drawers across 50 years. Jimmy Fallon was sitting on the floor of the stage, not on a chair. Not on the edge of the desk, on the floor of the stage, cross-legged, because his legs had stopped being reliable somewhere in the preceding 3 minutes, and the floor had seemed like the most honest place to be. He was looking at Stevie Nicks and Joanna Price, with both hands pressed flat on his knees and his mouth closed because his mouth had given up, and he had accepted this and found a kind of peace in it. He looked at the audience. He raised both hands, palms up, the gesture of someone presenting something they did not make and cannot take credit for and want only to acknowledge. 300 people rose. The band, which had been waiting as Stevie Nicks had told them to wait, began to play. Not the next song, the song. The one from the balcony, the one that had not been finished when Joanna said, "That's the one." Stevie Nicks stood up from the edge of the stage. She went back to the microphone. She sang Landslide from the beginning, the whole song simply, just her voice and the guitar, the way it was on the balcony in 1974. She sang it looking at Joanna Price in the 6th row, who stood with a photograph in each hand, and did not sit down for the duration of the song. And the studio was so quiet that every word arrived at every person in the room, as though it had been written for them specifically. Which is what the song has always done, and which is what Joanna Price heard on a balcony in Laurel Canyon, and recognized before anyone else. Questlove did not play during Landslide. He sat with his hands in his lap and listened. 3 camera operators were not looking through their viewfinders. The director in the control room held on Joanna Price's face for 11 seconds. Then she held on Stevie Nicks's face for 11 seconds. Then she held on the 2 photographs, one in each of Joanna's hands, for 11 seconds more. Because some images need time, and the director understood this and gave it. Stevie Nicks and Joanna Price talked for 2 hours after the cameras stopped. Cecily sat beside her mother and listened. She did not say "I told you so," which was the most generous thing she could have done, and she knew it. Stevie Nicks had a print made of the studio photograph, the one from 1974. The 2 women mid-laugh, enlarged, in a simple frame, and sent it to the studio in Flagstaff where Joanna's paintings hang in the window. It arrived on a Tuesday in April. Joanna hung it on the wall between 2 of her largest canvases, the one she has been working on for the past 3 years. The one she calls the Laurel Canyon series, because she has been painting from memory since Cecily held up the photograph in a television studio, and something that had been in a drawer for 50 years came back into the light. Joanna Price still paints in Flagstaff. She still has the paint on her cuffs. She still goes to the studio on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, the way she has gone for 40 years, making paintings that are her own and that have always been enough. She plays Landslide sometimes. In the studio, while she paints. She has always played it. She just knows now what she knew then, that the song was the right song, that it did not need changing, that some things are finished the moment they are made, if the right person is listening. She was the right person. She was listening. Some songs are written on balconies to audiences of one. Some audiences of one carry the song for 50 years in a drawer and a coat pocket, and the private knowledge of having been there when it became real. Some songs find their way back to the person who first heard them whole and say, "You knew. You always knew. Thank you for knowing." Landslide has been saying that to Joanna Price since 1974. On a Wednesday night in March 2024, in a studio in New York, she finally heard it say it out loud.